culture of compromise. Now, I don't know when the last time was that you had to do something or take some courageous act that required you to live with conviction, but I remember mine very distinctly. And maybe, in our everyday lives, there's conviction here and there, and you live with conviction as you go about your life, but there's some of those very special moments that require lots of conviction. It was a few years ago, actually next month, that I got down on one knee and proposed to my soon-to-be bride. Spoiler alert, she did say yes when I got down on one knee, but it was quite the moment. Now, I got to tell you, it wasn't that moment that required a ton of conviction. I already kind of knew, and she had that look in her eyes, that kind of googly little look in her eyes that she was totally falling for me and everything. So I was pretty confident that she was going to say yes. The moment that required a lot of conviction was the moment that took place a few weeks before I asked her to marry me, when I flew out to meet her dad in Virginia and ask him for her hand in marriage. Now, that day was full of all kinds of ups and downs and twists and turns, and there were a few curveballs thrown my way. That morning, I was planning to fly out in the morning, have lunch with her dad, and then fly back that night and even get to see Mia that night before she went home and went to bed for the evening. I didn't want her to know that I was gone or out of town for anything. So I had tons of meetings that day, or at least that's what I told her. So I flew out in the morning, and before I got on my plane, actually I got on the plane, but we sat there, we're like, man, we should have been pushing back by now. We had to fly to Chicago and then to Washington, D.C. Well, the flight to Chicago was getting delayed, and then, the captain says, well, some of you have connecting flights in Chicago, and if you're connecting to these 5 cities, we need you to get off this plane because you're not going to make it. We got another plane to put you on. And I didn't hear Washington, D.C. called. 15 minutes goes by. He gets back on the horn again, and if you have a connecting flight to these few cities, then you need to get off the plane. We've got another plane to get you to Chicago to make sure you make your connecting flight. But D.C. wasn't one of those cities. Then about 15 minutes later, the captain gets on and says, well, we actually need all of you to get off the plane now because somebody put our engine in upside down, and we're not going to be able to go anywhere anytime soon, or something to that effect, right? So everybody gets off the plane. I'm thinking I'm not going to get to Chicago, and if I don't get there, I'm not getting to D.C., and then I'm not asking for her hand in marriage, and then Mia's going to know that this all was messed up, and I'm going to have to make different plans on a different day. So I go and talk to the person at the table, and I said, I got to get to Washington, D.C. Yeah, sir, everybody here has to get somewhere, I'm sure. No, you don't understand. I'm going to ask my hopefully soon-to-be father-in-law for his daughter's hand in marriage. I got to get there, and I have a 4:50 flight out of D.C., so, I can't just get there around 3 o'clock this afternoon because I won't have time. So, long story short, they put me on a plane directly to Baltimore, and her dad drives over to Baltimore, which is about an hour away. We have lunch. He says yes for her, and so that she could say yes to me a few weeks later, and all worked out okay. But I'm telling you what, sitting at that picnic table in a state park with no eyewitnesses of what he could do to me anywhere nearby, with nobody within earshot of any kind of gunshot that could go off, by accident or anything like that, and with a cigar in our hands, I had a few questions I needed to ask him, and I had a few promises I had to make to him. And in that moment, I had to have complete conviction that I knew and complete confidence that this is the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. And I was so confident and full of conviction that moment was one of the greatest moments of my life. I enjoyed every moment of it. It was a good thing, and her dad was so gracious, and that moment, I'll never forget it, because it's those moments that help you live. It's those moments that get you to experience life the way it was meant to be experienced. And to be honest with you, I don't think conviction is necessary if you're not living a life worth living. But if you want to live a life worth living, if you want to live a life that's worth living, it requires conviction. Because nothing that's worth living comes easy. You've probably experienced that, haven't you? You've probably experienced somewhere along the way that anything that's worth owning, anything that's worth experiencing, anything that's worth achieving takes hard work, takes concentration, it takes conviction to get there. And when we look at the story of Daniel today, I think what we're going to see is that he's pursuing something that's totally worth it. He's living with conviction, even in a culture of compromise. Now, we might read some things over the next couple of weeks that you shake your head at and say, man, I can't believe that's happening. You know, how could Daniel let that happen? How could God let that happen? But it doesn't take much imagination for you to bridge the gap between what was happening then and what's happening today. In fact, it's not very different at all. Maybe things have changed. Maybe we're in a different country. Maybe technology is different. But I would suggest that we face just as much compromise, if not more, today in our culture than Daniel did in his day. And that's why I think if we spend a few weeks taking a look at the book of Daniel, learning from Daniel and the way he lives with conviction, there might be something in here for you. In fact, I'm betting that the Lord wants to speak into your life through his word in such a way to cause you to live with conviction. So if you would, turn to the book of Daniel in your Bible, on the app on your phone. It's in the Old Testament. It's getting closer to the end of the Old Testament. It's right after the book of Ezekiel. Lamentations is not far in front of it. Jeremiah is not far in front of it. If you're getting there, keep going to the book of Daniel. Let's get down to chapter 1 and begin to take a look at what it means to live with conviction in a culture of compromise. By the way, when we talk about conviction, we're not talking about the type of conviction that my father-in-law was looking for in my record, okay? That's not the conviction we're talking about. The conviction where I went to jail for something. He didn't find anything when he looked through my record, but that's not the conviction we're talking about. We're talking about the conviction and the dictionary kind of describes it this way. It says, a strong belief or opinion. It's something worth buying into. It's something, I would say, that drives you forward when oppression drives against. That's the kind of conviction we're talking about. And that's also not the kind of conviction that says, here's where I stand, and no matter who's against me, I'm against you. It's not about standing here and saying us versus them. It's not about Christians saying we're going to live a faith full of conviction against the world. This will be a theme that pops up today and over the next couple of weeks. But it's conviction of faith that lives in the world, but not of the world. There's a distinction there. This isn't a conviction that says we're going to stand our ground and oppose anything that comes against us. Why? Because Christians today are known so much more for what we're against than who we're for. And while God's calling us to stand for our faith, he also calls us to stand in the gap between people who are broken and lost and have no hope in Jesus and Jesus. He calls his church to be the ambassadors, if you will, as New Testament calls it, of Christ on behalf of him in the world. And that takes conviction to live in that way. So what I want to do is just read the first handful of verses here in Daniel chapter 1. I want to show you how Daniel begins to live with conviction. Just a little backstory before we dive in. Daniel is one of many people who's chosen by King Nebuchadnezzar to be led off and become a part of Babylon. They're taken captive in Babylon. So Daniel is an Israelite. He comes from the tribe of Judah, And what happened, and as you'll read in here in just a moment, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to the north, a pagan country, says to his servants, bring me the finest, the most handsome, the smartest, the most wise people so that they can serve me in my palace. And so they go and they handpick a whole bunch of folks, and Daniel is one of those people. Let's pick it up here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, pause right there, that's the king of Judah. That's the Israelites' king, if you will. That's God's chosen people, king of God's chosen people here, okay? In the 3rd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the pagan nation, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenazar, I didn't say that right at all, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So there's that backstory. King Nebuchadnezzar said, bring me the finest, and I want them to work in the palace. That happens, and as you'll find out in just a moment, Daniel is one of those people. He begins getting trained, and you'll notice that the king demanded that these people who are now working in the palace should eat and drink like the people in Babylonia do. This could cause a little bit of conflict. You'll see why in just a moment. Verse 6, among these were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belshazzar. To Hananiah, he gave the name Shadrach. To Mishael, he gave the name Meshach. And to Azariah, he gave the name Abednego. Now, maybe if you grew up in the church and you sang Sunday school songs and those kinds of things, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the 3 guys in the fiery furnace. We'll read about that in chapter 3 in the next couple of weeks. They were all given those names. We're going to talk about these names in just a minute. There's something very fascinating about that. But Daniel, verse 8, resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Now, this sounds a little outrageous. What's the big deal with the food, right? Well, if we were to go and read on just a little bit farther, we would find out that the food that Daniel and his men have been commanded to eat, just like all the other Babylonians, was food that was coming from sacrifices that had been made to pagan gods. We're going to hear just a little bit about those pagan gods in just a moment. But those pagan gods then received the first fruits, if you will, of the food that they were called to eat. In fact, even the wine that they were brought to drink was wine that was used, poured on the altar of different gods of the pagan religion that they believed in. So here, Daniel wasn't just being asked to eat really nice meals. Daniel was being asked to eat something that was used to worship another god. In other words, Daniel was being asked to compromise something in his faith. He was being asked to just give a little bit. I mean, couldn't he eat this food and drink this wine and still believe in the one true God? I mean, couldn't he just kind of pretend like that never really happened? I mean, if he wasn't there for the sacrifice, wouldn't that mean that then it really didn't happen? I mean, it's just like a tree falling in the forest, right? If you don't hear it, did it really fall? If this food was really sacrificed to those other gods, did it really happen? But Daniel knew that if everybody else saw him eating that food, that he would be recognized as somebody who believes the same things as them. That it'd be okay to worship other gods. So for Daniel and these men, it's a big deal not to compromise their faith, but instead to live with conviction. Now, this conviction is something that I want to suggest to you is not just something that they learn how to do over time, but that this conviction is actually rooted in their character. So if you look again, verses 6-7, listen to this. The name change that goes on here with Daniel and his men, these names have significant meaning to them. And I want to show these to you. As you look through verses 6 and 7, you can also see them on the screen. You'll see that the king or the king's servant has Daniel's name changed to Belshazzar. Belshazzar is an interesting name because Daniel, the name Daniel itself means God is my judge. But because King Nebuchadnezzar and his servants wanted to make these people from the tribe of Judah more like them, they wanted these folks of faith to compromise who they were just that much more. They changed their names. They changed their identity. They changed who they were. So now Daniel's name wasn't just God is my judge. Now his name means Baal, protect his life, as if to say his name should be a plea to this pagan god Baal to be his protector. Hananiah, one of the men that came with him, his name was changed to Shadrach. Hananiah, his name meant the Lord shows grace. Don't you just kind of want to change your name to Hananiah after hearing that? I mean, it's just so beautiful. Like, your name means the Lord shows grace. But they changed his name to Command of Aku. Now that sounds really weird and everything, but Aku was their moon god. This is their pagan religion. This is what they believe. So let's get Hananiah, the one who speaks about the Lord's grace, the one whose identity is the Lord shows grace. And let's change that so his message might be different. Let's compromise who he is just a little bit so that he would point to a different God. Mishael, his name is changed to Meshach. Mishael means who is what God is, as if to say, who can compare to my God? And look at what they changed his name to. Meshach means who is what Aku is, that moon god that they believe in. Interesting, isn't it? Now they try to say that Aku, this moon god, is above all reproach, is beyond compare to any other god. And Azariah, the fourth man of this group, his name is changed to Abednego. So his name's meaning changes from the Lord helps to servant of Nego, another pagan god. As if to say, compromise begins with character. And character is shifted in our identity. You see, what we learn about Daniel and these men here is that if you want to compromise someone's values, if you want to just change a little bit, if you want them to just lean a little more this way or get them to do that kind of thing, you change who they are. You get them to forget where they come from. You get them to forget who they are. If you can compromise their character, maybe you can compromise their conviction. But as we saw, Daniel didn't quickly forget who he was. In the next few verses, he goes back to that man who told him the decree that he should eat this food and drink that wine, and he says, I don't want to defile myself. Will you allow me to not partake in this? Which is interesting, and I think paints a really good picture for us of what it means to be a Christian in today's culture. Because where most Christian churches and most American Christianity, if you will, says we need to take our stand against the world, what Daniel does is said, I'm going to take my stand within the world. I'm not here to change everybody else. I just want to hold true to what I believe. Because I believe that if I live with conviction, others will see, and there will be a better opportunity for me to show the love of God, the one true God, than for me to just tell people about what's wrong and right. If our message of who God is and what Jesus came to do for us starts or begins with the phrase of you need to or you should, then we're already off track. The message and the conversation of Jesus and Christianity starts and ends with what Jesus already did. For each and every one of us, as we look at Daniel here, we see what it means to take a stand and live with conviction, but to do it in a way that doesn't alienate others. If anything, Daniel lives with this conviction and begins to earn the trust of the person who is afraid that his head would get cut off. Talk about somebody who's looking for somebody worth trusting. He can't trust his king because there could be a death sentence waiting for him there. Except here's this man, Daniel, who lives with conviction. Perhaps he's somebody I can trust. All this is happening. We begin to see just in chapter 1 that King Nebuchadnezzar, his servants, and everyone in Babylon sees the people of Judah that are coming as part of this exile here in this passage and in the groups of people that would come in exile in the years to come as they would go back to Jerusalem and completely destroy Jerusalem and the temple in it. All these people become exiles, and the Babylonians begin to see people who are living with conviction. And that conviction has more to do with who you are than how you live with conviction. And so as we look at this, I just want to ask the question, why is it important for you and I, as we begin this study of conviction in a culture of compromise, to wrestle with the character question? Why should you care about your character? Number one is this: character causes you to live courageously. Character. It's character that causes you to live courageously. Daniel, here just in chapter 1, we're just getting started. There's many more chapters of this to go. Just in chapter 1, we begin to see right off the bat, Daniel lives courageously, is willing to put himself out on the line because it's who he is. Character should matter to you and I because it's character that causes us to live courageously. And I know so many of you are facing situations that not just it would be nice to have courage, but it's demanding you to live courageously. You're staring massive challenges or new seasons of life or uncertainty that could just strip away all the courage that you have. But if I had one thing to tell you today, and that one thing was that you're not what you do, but you are who Jesus says you are, and that makes you an heir of the King, a son of the Father, then you got a whole lot of courage to press forward with. You're not just your job title. You're so much more than just whatever socioeconomical level you are. You're not just what you make. You're not just what you do or what you haven't done. You're a son of the Father in heaven. And that changes the game. Second reason why character should matter to you, and why character is important for us to talk about today as we begin this conversation on conviction in a culture of compromise, is because character is always undervalued and competency is overvalued. If you notice in today's business world, people always get hired for their competency, but get fired for their character. Isn't that true? You've probably seen it in your own workplace. You've seen this all over the place where somebody has the right skill set. Somebody is able to answer the how question, but they can't answer the who question, if you will. I know how to accomplish something. I'm competent to achieve this. I have the skill set to do something, but I'm willing to compromise who I am. I'm willing to let my integrity slide a little bit. I don't think anybody can really see my character. As long as I kind of put on a good show in the workplace, or the best place to put on a show, let's be honest, is right here on Sunday morning, because there's church people judging me and I better put on the right show, right? As long as they don't see what's going on behind the scenes, as long as God doesn't see what happens when nobody's around, as long as nobody knows the real condition of my heart and I'm able to just get things done, I can accomplish the task, I'm skillful for the opportunity, then I'll be all right. I want you to grab a piece of paper and a pen. I want to just give you an illustration, and it's going to require a little bit of drawing. So if you're an artist, you're ahead of the game. If you're not, don't worry. It's just lines and writing, okay? So you don't have to be too scared. But I want to take character and competency just very quickly and show you how they fit together and where the dangers fall when it comes to undervaluing character and overvaluing competency. We have a little matrix here on the screen for you. And on the vertical axis here, I want you to put competency on that axis. And at the top of it, this is where you start drawing what you see up on the screen, sorry. On the vertical axis is character. And at the top of that axis, put high character, lots of character. This would be a 10. Right? Lots of character. You know who you are. You live with integrity. You are a son of the Father and heir of the King, okay? At the bottom of that axis would be a 1, so low character. This is no integrity. This is no character, if you will. And then on that horizontal axis is where we want to put competency. And if on the right side you have high competency, i.e., you have the skill set, you know the how question. This is how we will tackle the task at hand, right? Then on the left-hand side of that axis, you have, anybody want to guess? It's on the screen. Low competency, there we go. All right, we're awake this morning, kind of. Low competency, right, on the left side. And then when you put those together, you get 4 quadrants. And here's what happens when you put those together. Let's start up in that top left-hand corner of the matrix. When you have high character and it meets low competency, i.e., you know who you are, but you don't have the skill set to live it out, you are limited in the amount of breakthrough that you'll see. Or, let's put it this way, you're limited in the good you can do. If you have high character, lots of good in you, but you have low competency, then you're limited in the good that you can do. Let's go to the bottom left quadrant, where low character meets low competency. As we go around this, you'll probably discover this is not where you want to be, right? This is the worst of the 4 quadrants. If you have low character and low competency, you are limited in the amount of harm that you can do, which might be a good thing that you're limited in the amount of harm that you can do, right? But here's where the scary part gets, okay? Because in the bottom right-hand quadrant is where I would put America. I mean, I know that's like a very broad brush to paint with, but let's just overgeneralize for just a moment, okay? Where low character, the very bottom of the vertical axis, meets high competency, you become unlimited in the harm you can do. Now just catch that for just a moment. If there's low character at play here, no integrity, no set of values, no conviction, no core beliefs, you're willing to compromise who you are, if you will. And there's high competency. You have all the skills in the world. You've taken all the tests. They put you at the top of the charts in every single way. You got the best GPA. You've got the top title in the company. You've been climbing the ladder. You've earned this. You've earned that. You've got all the skills in the world, but you have low character. You are unlimited in the harm you can do. Suddenly, the conversation is not just about competency. It's not just about how you live with conviction. It's the who question as well. Who am I? And therefore, I can live with conviction. Does that make sense? And then up in the top right quadrant, where high character, all the good in the world, meets high competency, all the skill in the world, you are unlimited in the good you can do. You are unlimited in the good that you can do. So what I want to do is just help us get to that place. Help us get to that quadrant. And it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen just in one message. It doesn't happen in one series. This is a lifelong journey. But if we might suggest to you how we get there, along with who we are, then that would be a good place for us to start as a church. And so over the next couple of weeks, as we go through this series, I want to highlight each week one of our values here at our church. And the first value I want to highlight, and the one I want us to just listen to for just a moment this morning, is our first one. And our first value is follow Jesus over fit into religion. If this is a conviction that we have as a church, if this is a core value, then it starts to permeate into the everyday lives that we live. Not just what we do when we show up to church on Sunday morning, but it's who we are. We are people who follow Jesus instead of just trying to fit into religion, which means that it's okay if you don't have everything figured out. If your life isn't all in order and you're here this morning, good, you're in great company because everybody else in here is in the same boat. We're not here to try and make you fit into religion. We're here to follow Jesus as a church. The place we get that from is in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2. By the way, these are on our website under the About Us section, under our mission, vision, and values. If you want to go look at those, you certainly can. But 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2 says this. Paul, in his letter to Corinth, says, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." In Paul's statement to the church in Corinth right there as we close this morning, you hear words of conviction. You hear words of core truths, core values, things we're not willing to compromise. And as a church, and as followers of Jesus, that should be something that we want to cling to. Or let me suggest this. If you want to live a life worth living, it's something that life demands you to live with, and that's conviction. Conviction begins with our character in who we are. And this isn't just let's live a life worth living, although that'd be a great title of a book and we can make millions of dollars like everybody else does. It's not just about that. It's about knowing who you are. Because I think that is questioned every time we walk in and out of the office, or every time we walk in and out of the house, or every time we go to the country club, or every time we go to the pool, or every time we hang out with neighbors. Who we are is that question. And if you're living a life worth living, then people are going to question who you are. Because there's going to be something worth knowing about in that life. That man who was fearful for his life for allowing Daniel and his men to not eat that food and not drink that wine, he was a man that saw Daniel living with conviction and began to be intrigued. Believe that the conviction God's calling his church to live with is not a conviction that says, here I stand and everyone else is against me, or here stands the church and we're against everyone else. I believe the conviction that God's calling us to live with is a conviction that intrigues people about why we believe what we believe. It intrigues people to know who we are and who they can be because of Jesus. And we don't stand here as people full of conviction pointing at people with judgment. We stand here full of conviction pointing people to Jesus, who gives more grace than we can even fathom. Let's pray. God, some days I wake up and I wish life didn't require much conviction, and I wish life came a little more easily. And I wish everyone believed what I did and was just like me. Because God, sometimes I can be extremely stubborn and I can lack conviction. But Lord, that's not what you've called your church to do. You don't call your church to just gather like-minded people who look the same or act the same. Maybe you're speaking to us now, God. God, you call us to be people who live with faith, full of conviction, so that your world can be intrigued by the grace you give. Lord, may you instill in us that conviction full of grace and truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.